On a cold, rainy evening in a bustling city, Eliza, a poor young woman struggling to make ends meet, stumbles upon a lost, frightened girl named Emily. Unaware that this simple act of kindness will change her life forever, Eliza takes the child in, only to discover that Emily is the missing daughter of a widowed millionaire. As Eliza navigates a web of secrets, lies, and emotional conflicts, the reward she receives for returning the girl is far from the one she expected. Title: A poor young woman helps a lost girl and discovers she is the missing daughter of a widowed millionaire. What he offers as a reward will surprise you. Eliza lived in a run-down apartment in the poorer part of town. Life had been hard for as long as she could remember. Orphaned as a child, she had learned to survive on her own, taking odd jobs that barely kept her afloat. Despite her struggles, she had a kind heart and an inner strength that helped her endure. She dreamed of a better life, but the weight of her circumstances often crushed those dreams before they had a chance to take flight. It was a late autumn evening when Eliza first saw Emily. The wind whipped through the streets, and rain poured down in relentless sheets. Eliza had just finished a long shift at a local diner and was walking home, her shoes soaked and her spirits low. As she passed an alleyway, something caught her attention, a small figure, huddled against a wall, shivering and alone. The little girl couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, her blonde hair matted and soaked through, her clothes too thin for the weather. Eliza's heart clenched at the sight. Without a second thought, she approached the girl. "Are you okay?" Eliza asked gently, kneeling beside her. The girl looked up with wide, frightened eyes. "I'm lost," she whispered, her voice trembling. Eliza couldn't leave her there. "Come with me," she said softly, offering her hand. "I'll help you." The girl hesitated for a moment, then took Eliza's hand. Together, they walked back to Eliza's small apartment. Inside, Eliza wrapped the girl in a blanket and offered her a warm cup of tea. The girl introduced herself as Emily and said she had been separated from her nanny in the crowded city streets. As Emily talked, Eliza felt a growing sense of unease. Something about the girl's story didn't add up, but she couldn't place what it was. "I'll call the police and let them know I've found you," Eliza said, but the girl looked terrified at the suggestion. "No. Please, don't call them," Emily begged. "They won't believe me." Confused but concerned, Eliza decided to hold off on calling the authorities for the moment. She didn't want to scare the girl any further. Over the next few days, Eliza took care of Emily, feeding her, cleaning her clothes, and trying to get more information about her family. Emily was evasive, revealing little beyond her first name and the fact that she lived in a big house. Eliza's initial plan had been to find out where Emily lived and return her, but as days passed, she grew attached to the girl. During this time, strange things began happening. Eliza noticed that men in dark suits were watching her building. She saw them more frequently as the days went by, and each time they seemed to be looking for someone, possibly Emily. One night, as Eliza lay awake thinking about what to do, she overheard Emily talking in her sleep. The girl muttered something about a mansion, a garden, and Papa. The next morning, Eliza pressed Emily for more information. "Who is your papa?" she asked softly. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "My papa is gone," she said. "I want to go home, but they took me away." Eliza's heart sank. "Who took you?" Emily didn't answer, and Eliza didn't push her any further. But it became clear that something more sinister was at play. Eliza knew she couldn't keep the girl hidden forever, and the men watching her building seemed to be closing in. One afternoon, while Eliza was at work, she noticed a newspaper left on one of the tables at the diner. The headline caught her eye: "Widowed millionaire desperately searches for missing daughter." Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she read further. The article detailed the story of Jonathan Hargrave, a wealthy businessman whose daughter had disappeared 3 months earlier. Despite offering a large reward, there had been no credible leads. Eliza stared at the grainy photograph of the little girl. It was Emily. The realization hit her like a freight train. Emily wasn't just a lost child, she was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the city. Conflicted, Eliza didn't know what to do. She knew she had to return Emily to her father, but she feared what might happen to the girl in the process. And what would happen to her? Could she trust Jonathan Hargrave? That night, Eliza confronted Emily. "Emily, I think I know who you are," she said gently. "Your father has been looking for you." Emily's face paled. "No, please, don't take me back," she cried. "It's not safe there." Eliza's mind raced. Why would Emily say that? Wasn't her father looking for her? The questions piled up, and the more Eliza thought about it, the more suspicious she became. But with the men outside still watching her building, she knew she couldn't keep Emily much longer. Eliza made the difficult decision to contact Jonathan Hargrave. She called the number listed in the newspaper and arranged a meeting. That night, a black car pulled up outside her apartment, and 2 men in dark suits escorted her and Emily to Hargrave's mansion on the outskirts of the city. The mansion was grand and imposing, with high walls and a sprawling garden, just as Emily had described. As they entered, Eliza noticed how cold and sterile the place felt, more like a fortress than a home. Jonathan Hargrave was waiting for them in the grand foyer. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and a face marked by years of grief. When he saw Emily, his eyes filled with tears. "Emily," he whispered, kneeling to embrace her. But to Eliza's shock, Emily shrank away from him, clinging to her instead. "Please, I don't want to stay here," Emily sobbed. Jonathan looked up at Eliza, his expression confused. "What's going on?" Eliza didn't know what to say. She had expected a happy reunion, but Emily's reaction told a different story. There was something wrong, something she didn't understand yet. Jonathan led them to a sitting room and asked Eliza to explain how she had found Emily. As she recounted the events of the past few days, she noticed Jonathan growing more and more agitated. "I'll pay you the reward I promised," he said, his voice tense. "But Emily belongs here. She needs to stay." Eliza wasn't sure she could leave Emily behind. The girl was terrified, and something about Jonathan's demeanor unsettled her. But what could she do? She was just a poor woman with no power in this world. As Eliza wrestled with her conscience, she noticed a woman standing in the doorway. She was older, with sharp eyes and a stern expression, Hargrave's sister, as it turned out. The woman seemed to have a strange hold over Jonathan, dictating the household's rules and overseeing everything with an iron fist. "Emily is better off here," the woman said coldly. "You've done your part, Mississippi. Take your money and go." But Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. As the days passed, she found herself returning to the mansion, unable to walk away from the girl who had come to mean so much to her. One evening, Eliza overheard a heated argument between Jonathan and his sister. She listened in horror as she learned the truth. Jonathan's sister had orchestrated Emily's disappearance to control her brother's fortune. Emily had been hidden away for months, and the woman had intended to keep her lost for good, only for Eliza to unexpectedly intervene. Realizing the danger Emily was in, Eliza knew she had to act fast. But confronting the powerful Hargrave family was risky, especially since they had resources she couldn't match. Eliza devised a plan. She knew she couldn't take on the Hargrave family alone, so she went to the police with the information she had overheard. At first, they were skeptical. After all, she was just a poor woman making accusations against a wealthy, influential family. But with persistence and evidence, the authorities finally agreed to investigate. The following night, under the cover of darkness, the police raided the mansion. Jonathan's sister was arrested, and the truth about Emily's disappearance was exposed. Emily was finally free from the grip of her manipulative aunt, and Jonathan, realizing how blind he had been to his sister's schemes, was devastated. In the aftermath, Jonathan Hargrave offered Eliza the reward he had promised, a large sum of money that could have changed her life. But Eliza, who had grown to care for Emily deeply, realized that the greatest reward wasn't money, it was knowing that she had saved a child from a life of fear and manipulation. Jonathan, humbled by Eliza's selflessness, made her an unexpected offer. He asked her to stay and help care for Emily, offering her a place in their lives. Though Eliza had been wary of the wealthy world Jonathan inhabited, she couldn't deny that she had come to love Emily like a daughter. After much consideration, Eliza agreed. She moved into the mansion, not as a servant or an outsider, but as a trusted companion and caregiver to Emily. Together, they formed a new family, one built not on wealth or status, but on love, trust, and the shared experience of overcoming adversity. The mansion, once cold and unwelcoming, slowly became a home filled with warmth and laughter. And for the first time in her life, Eliza knew what it meant to truly belong. The end. A grieving millionaire visits his son's grave, seeking peace and solitude. But when he finds a young man standing there, silently weeping, the encounter sets off a chain of events that will unravel painful truths and family secrets and lead to a heart-wrenching confrontation that no one could have predicted. What the millionaire discovers will shake him to the core and change both their lives forever. Title: A millionaire finds a young man at his son's grave. You won't believe what happened next. The story begins with Jonathan Price, a man who had built an empire from scratch. He was a self-made millionaire with everything: wealth, power, respect, but none of it could fill the void left by his son's untimely death. His son, David, had been the light of his life, the one person Jonathan had hoped would carry on his legacy. But David had died tragically in a car accident a year ago, and Jonathan had never been the same since. Every week, Jonathan visited David's grave, leaving flowers and sitting for hours, just talking to his son. It was the only place where he felt connected to him. His wife, Margaret, had coped by throwing herself into charity work, but Jonathan found no comfort in distractions. He was consumed by his grief, and every visit to the grave felt like reliving the day he lost David all over again. On a cold, gray morning, Jonathan arrived at the cemetery as usual. The sun was barely up, and the fog hung low, making the place feel eerie and quiet. As he approached his son's grave, something caught his eye. Someone was already there. A young man, around David's age, stood before the tombstone, his head bowed and shoulders trembling as if he was crying. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen this person before. Who was this stranger, and why was he here? Anger and curiosity bubbled up in Jonathan's chest. How dare someone intrude on this private space, his sanctuary of grief? He stepped closer, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. The young man didn't move. Who are you? Jonathan's voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness. Why are you at my son's grave? The young man slowly turned around, his eyes red and swollen from crying. There was a deep sadness in his expression, but also something else, a look of guilt, or maybe fear. I'm sorry, the young man whispered. I didn't mean to intrude. I had to see him. Jonathan frowned, his anger softening into confusion. You knew my son? The young man nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. Yes, sir. He was my best friend. The words hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. Best friend? He had never heard David mention this young man before. David's circle of friends had been small, consisting mainly of people from their wealthy social circles, and yet here stood someone who looked nothing like those people. His clothes were simple, worn, and he seemed nervous, out of place in this polished cemetery. What's your name? Jonathan asked, his tone softer now but still guarded. The young man hesitated before answering, My name is Ethan. Ethan Walker. Jonathan searched his memory, but the name didn't ring a bell. I don't remember David mentioning you. Ethan looked down, fidgeting with his hands. We weren't friends for very long. But he meant a lot to me, and I wanted to pay my respects. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. There was something off about Ethan, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. How did you meet my son? Ethan hesitated again, glancing at the grave as if he were afraid to speak. We met, through someone else. I'd rather not go into it, if that's okay. The vagueness of Ethan's response only fueled Jonathan's suspicion. But before he could press further, Ethan turned toward the grave, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Price. David was a good person. He didn't deserve what happened to him. Jonathan's heart twisted painfully. No, he whispered, he didn't. There was a long, uncomfortable silence before Ethan wiped his face again and muttered, I should go. Without waiting for a response, Ethan hurried away, disappearing into the fog. As Jonathan drove home, Ethan's words echoed in his mind. The encounter had stirred something in him, something dark and unsettling. Why had David never mentioned Ethan? And why had the young man seemed so nervous, so full of sorrow? Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. He needed answers. That night, he told Margaret about the encounter, but she dismissed it as a coincidence, just another grieving friend. Jonathan, however, was not convinced. He decided to do some digging. The next day, Jonathan hired a private investigator to look into Ethan Walker. Days passed with no news, and Jonathan's obsession grew. He visited David's grave more frequently, half expecting to see Ethan there again. But the young man never returned. Then, one evening, the investigator called. What he revealed sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. Mr. Price, the investigator began, I found out a few things about Ethan Walker. He's not who he seems. Jonathan gripped the phone tightly. What do you mean? He comes from a troubled background. His father was involved in some criminal activities, and Ethan himself has had a rough life. But here's the kicker, he and David knew each other through more than just friendship. There's evidence suggesting that Ethan might have been involved in David's accident. Jonathan felt his blood run cold. What? Are you saying he killed my son? I'm not sure. But there are some strange connections. Ethan was seen arguing with David the night of the accident. There were rumors that David was helping Ethan with something dangerous. Furious and overwhelmed, Jonathan couldn't sit back any longer. He needed to confront Ethan, to demand the truth. He returned to the cemetery, hoping to find the young man there again. Sure enough, Ethan was at David's grave, kneeling in front of the tombstone with his head bowed. Jonathan stormed over, his voice trembling with rage. You were there the night he died, weren't you? Ethan's head snapped up, his face pale. Mr. Price, please. Don't lie to me. Jonathan shouted. What happened that night? Were you involved in my son's death? Ethan stood, shaking his head, tears streaming down his face. No. I didn't kill David. I swear, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Jonathan grabbed Ethan by the collar, his grief and anger boiling over. Tell me the truth. Ethan sobbed, barely able to speak. David, he was trying to help me. I was in trouble, deep trouble, and he was the only one who believed in me. But things went wrong, and now he's gone because of me. Jonathan's grip loosened as the truth began to sink in. What kind of trouble? Ethan wiped his tears, his voice barely a whisper. David was helping me get out of a bad situation with some dangerous people. He didn't tell you because he didn't want to worry you. But that night, things went south, and the accident happened. It was my fault. I shouldn't have dragged him into it. Jonathan was stunned, his heart breaking all over again. His son had died trying to help this young man, and now Ethan was standing here, consumed by guilt. I'm so sorry, Ethan whispered. If I could trade places with him, I would. I didn't want any of this to happen. Jonathan, still trembling with anger and grief, took a step back. He wanted to hate Ethan, to blame him for everything, but deep down, he knew that weeks passed after Jonathan's confrontation with Ethan. He couldn't stop thinking about their conversation, about how his son had risked his life for someone else. Jonathan felt a storm of conflicting emotions, rage, sorrow, guilt, but above all, he realized that holding on to his anger wouldn't bring David back. One evening, Jonathan returned to the cemetery. This time, instead of demanding answers, he sought something else, closure. He found Ethan sitting at David's grave again, as if he hadn't left since their last encounter. Jonathan approached quietly and sat beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. Finally, Jonathan broke the silence. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you for what happened. But David believed in you. And I need to believe that he saw something in you worth saving. Ethan looked at him, his eyes filled with remorse. I'll never forgive myself, Mr. Price. But if there's anything I can do, anything to make this right, I'll do it. Jonathan nodded slowly. Maybe the best way to honor David is to make sure you don't waste the life he saved. In the months that followed, Jonathan began to mentor Ethan, helping him get his life back on track. Ethan worked hard to turn his life around, driven by the guilt of David's death, but also by a desire to live up to the faith David had placed in him. The process wasn't easy, and there were many setbacks along the way. But as time passed, both men found a measure of peace in their shared grief. Jonathan realized that in helping Ethan, he was also healing himself. 1 year after their first meeting, Jonathan and Ethan stood side by side at David's grave. This time, the air was lighter, and the fog had lifted. The cemetery, once a place of sorrow, now felt like a place of reflection and remembrance. Jonathan placed a fresh bouquet of flowers on the grave, then looked at Ethan. "You've come a long way." Ethan nodded, his voice steady. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jonathan smiled sadly. "You couldn't have done it without David." As they stood there in silence, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. He had lost his son, and that pain would never fully fade, but in helping Ethan, he had found a way to keep David's memory alive. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy his son could have left behind, not wealth or power, but the power to change a life for the better. As they prepared to leave, Jonathan took one last look at David's grave, whispering, "Rest easy, my son. I'll carry your light forward." With Ethan by his side, Jonathan walked away from the cemetery, leaving behind not just a grave, but a chapter of his life filled with pain and loss. But ahead of them lay something new, hope, redemption, and the possibility of a brighter future. The end. John Astor, a self-made millionaire who built his empire from the ground up, had everything: wealth, power, and respect. Yet, one thing eluded him: genuine love. Hidden behind the luxury in the business deals, John yearned for authenticity, for someone who would see him as just another man, stripped of the fortune, stripped of the fame. And that's when he met Lily, a young waitress in a cozy downtown diner, whose kindness, simplicity, and radiance drew him in like nothing else ever had. But how could he ever be sure that she would love him for who he was, and not for the figure he represented? Driven by curiosity and fear of rejection, John devises a plan. He would disguise himself as a beggar to test her true character. What he didn't anticipate was how drastically this plan would change not only his perception of Lily, but of the world around him. Title: A millionaire disguise himself as a beggar to test the waitress he was in love with. But he was shocked by the way she treated him. John Astor was a man with a past shaped by humble beginnings. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood where every penny counted, and he watched his parents struggle to make ends meet. Determined to rise above his circumstances, John worked tirelessly, often taking on odd jobs, learning the art of business, and investing in small ventures that eventually paid off. By the time he turned 35, John had amassed a fortune that others could only dream of. He was the owner of a sprawling estate, had multiple cars, and traveled the world in private jets. His wealth granted him access to elite circles, and he was often in the company of celebrities and politicians. But despite his success, there was a void in his life, a loneliness that only seemed to grow as his wealth increased. People were drawn to his money, not to the man behind it. One day, while walking in the city incognito, dressed in simple clothes and a baseball cap, John wandered into a small diner that he had passed countless times before. Inside, he was greeted by Lily, a waitress in her mid-20s with a warm smile that seemed to light up the room. Unlike the cold, calculating people he usually dealt with, Lily was genuine. She treated him with kindness, paying no mind to his simple attire. She spoke to him as if he were an ordinary customer, asking about his day and recommending the best items on the menu. For the first time in years, John felt seen, not as a millionaire, but as a man. He found himself returning to the diner more often, sitting in Lily's section, and engaging in light-hearted conversations. Over time, his feelings for her grew, but so did his fear. He couldn't shake the nagging question, would she still treat him the same if she knew about his fortune? The thought gnawed at him until one evening, John came up with an idea. He would disguise himself as a beggar, someone down on his luck, and see how Lily would treat him when he appeared to be at his lowest. He figured this would be the ultimate test of her character. It was extreme, but John had learned over the years that money made people act differently, and he needed to be sure. The next morning, he dressed in ragged clothes, dirted his face, and left his luxury car several blocks away from the diner. He walked with a limp, holding a cup in his hand as he made his way to the entrance. His heart raced as he pushed the door open, feeling the curious glances from other customers. Would Lily recognize him? Would she still smile at him the way she had before? When Lily approached, she didn't seem to notice that the beggar in front of her was the same man who had sat in her section numerous times. Her smile faltered as she looked him up and down. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice lacking the usual warmth. I don't have much money," John stammered, keeping up the act. "Just looking for a cup of coffee, if that's okay." Lily's expression hardened, and she crossed her arms. "This isn't a charity. If you can't afford to pay, you can't stay." John was taken aback. This was not the Lily he had grown fond of, the kind and gentle waitress who always had a kind word for everyone. He tried to reason with her, saying he could pay for the coffee with the little change he had, but she was unmoved. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him sitting at the counter, humiliated. The shock of Lily's coldness shook John to his core. His heart felt heavy, not just from the rejection, but from the realization that perhaps he had been wrong about her all along. He had thought she was different, that she had seen something in him beyond the surface, but now it seemed like she was just like everyone else, judging people by their appearance. But John wasn't ready to give up just yet. He needed to know if this was just a momentary lapse in her kindness or if it was who she truly was. Over the next few days, he returned to the diner, always in his beggar disguise. Each time, Lily treated him the same way, cold, dismissive, and impatient. She never smiled, never engaged in conversation. It was as if she saw him as less than human. One afternoon, as he sat by the window in his beggar's clothes, John overheard a conversation between Lily and one of her coworkers. She was complaining about her job, about how tired she was of serving rude customers, and how she dreamed of escaping the drudgery of waitressing. "I just want someone to take me away from all this," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "Someone who can give me the life I deserve." The word stung. Was that all she wanted? To be saved by someone with money? Was that the real reason she had been so kind to him before, when she thought he was just an ordinary customer? Just when John thought he had figured Lily out, something unexpected happened. One evening, after the diner had closed, he saw Lily leaving through the back door. She was alone, and it was clear from her body language that she was upset. Curiosity got the better of him, and he followed her at a distance, careful not to be seen. Lily walked down the street to a small apartment building, her shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. John watched from the shadows as she entered the building. He debated whether to leave, but something urged him to stay. A few minutes later, he saw her reappear at the window of a second-floor apartment, where she collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. She was crying. For the first time, John saw Lily not as the waitress who had treated him coldly, but as a young woman struggling with her own battles. His heart softened. Maybe there was more to her story than he had realized. The next day, John returned to the diner, this time as himself, clean-shaven, dressed in his usual attire, and with his wealth visible once again. When Lily saw him, her demeanor immediately changed. She greeted him with a bright smile, just as she had in the beginning. But John no longer saw her through the same lens. The days he had spent in disguise had opened his eyes to the complexities of her character. She wasn't a saint, but she wasn't a villain either. She was simply human, flawed, tired, and desperate for a way out of her own struggles. He asked to speak with her privately after her shift, and she agreed, though her expression was tinged with nervousness. They walked to a nearby park, where they sat on a bench beneath a tree. John hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Lily," he began, "I need to tell you something. Over the past few days, I've been coming into the diner, but not as myself. I've been disguising myself as a beggar, to see how you would treat me." Lily's eyes widened in shock, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "Why would you do that?" "Because I needed to know if you were being kind to me because of who I am, or because of who you thought I was." Lily was silent for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry if I treated you badly. It's just, this job, this life, it's hard. And sometimes, I take it out on people who don't deserve it. But that doesn't make it right." John nodded, understanding her more than he ever had before. "I know you're struggling, Lily. And I can help you, but not the way you think." In the weeks that followed, John and Lily's relationship evolved. He didn't sweep her off her feet with money or grand gestures, but instead, they grew closer through honesty and vulnerability. John helped Lily enroll in classes so she could pursue her dream of becoming a teacher, and in return, Lily taught John something he hadn't realized he needed, the importance of empathy, of seeing beyond the surface. Their love wasn't built on wealth or status, but on mutual respect and understanding. And while their journey had been filled with twists, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt, in the end, they found something far more valuable than either of them had expected: each other. The end. In the glimmering city of Ebrington, where skyscrapers pierce the heavens and technology reshapes the world daily, lived a tech millionaire, Adrian Cross, whose innovative mind had made him a household name. Known for his brilliance but cursed with loneliness, Adrian's heart craved something money couldn't buy: authentic love. He hired a poor woman, Ella Doone, to be his girlfriend for a high society event. Little did he know, Ella's fiery words at a simple dinner table would unravel secrets that could bring his empire crumbling and turn their contract into a roller coaster of tragedy, redemption, and unexpected love. Adrian Cross was a prodigy of technology. By 30, he had revolutionized artificial intelligence, making millions. But beneath his polished exterior and suave charisma lay scars of a lonely childhood and betrayals that had rendered him distrustful of people's intentions. The upcoming annual gala hosted by Ebrington's elite loomed large. To keep up appearances, Adrian needed a companion, someone who could charm without expectations of commitment. A colleague recommended an unconventional agency specializing in discreet, companionship contracts. Ella Doone, a waitress struggling to make ends meet, lived in a crumbling part of Ebrington. A talented artist with dreams she had long buried, Ella was pragmatic and sharp-witted. When she stumbled upon the ad for a temporary companion job with an eye-popping payout, she reluctantly applied. Her goal? Pay her debts and leave the suffocating city behind. Their meeting was formal. Adrian laid out the contract, emphasizing the boundaries: no personal questions, no emotional involvement, and absolute discretion. Ella, unfazed, signed the papers with a wry smile, masking her unease at entering his opulent but cold world. Adrian invited Ella to a dinner with prominent tech magnates before the gala. Her role was simple: smile, nod, and blend in. But Ella's authenticity clashed with the superficial world Adrian inhabited. At dinner, when an influential investor belittled artists as useless dreamers, Ella's retort, sharp, eloquent, and unfiltered, stunned everyone. Adrian, though initially furious, found himself intrigued. Ella's words resonated, challenging the very cynicism he had adopted. Yet, her boldness also put a target on his back. Ella's moment of defiance earned her both admiration and enemies. The investor she confronted, Victor Henshaw, was one of Adrian's top stakeholders. Victor warned Adrian that associating with someone like Ella could damage his reputation. Meanwhile, the media began speculating about their relationship, escalating tensions. Adrian's facade started to crack. He began questioning his choices and the loneliness that had driven him to hire Ella. For her part, Ella struggled with guilt and confusion. She hadn't expected to see glimpses of vulnerability in Adrian or feel drawn to the man behind the mask. As their public appearances continued, Ella accidentally discovered a hidden project Adrian had been working on, a revolutionary AI capable of manipulating human emotions. Adrian admitted it was designed to help people understand empathy but was being exploited by Victor for sinister purposes. Ella urged Adrian to expose Victor, but he hesitated, fearing the consequences. Their relationship, once strictly transactional, grew complicated. Adrian admired Ella's courage, while Ella saw the man Adrian could become if he faced his demons. At the gala, Adrian unveiled his AI project, defying Victor's orders to keep it secret. However, Victor retaliated by leaking Ella's financial struggles and their contract to the press, framing her as a gold digger. Overnight, Ella became the center of a scandal. Betrayed and humiliated, Ella confronted Adrian, accusing him of using her as a pawn. Adrian, devastated, realized he had to make a choice: protect his empire or fight for Ella and his own integrity. Adrian decided to expose Victor, risking his career and fortune. In a dramatic press conference, he revealed the true purpose of his AI project and the unethical practices Victor had enforced. Adrian also admitted the truth about his arrangement with Ella, taking full responsibility. Meanwhile, Ella, overwhelmed by the media frenzy, returned to her small apartment, vowing never to trust anyone from Adrian's world again. But Adrian wasn't ready to let her go. Adrian's confession brought him both ruin and redemption. Victor was ousted, and Adrian's AI project was salvaged under ethical guidelines. However, Adrian's empire was irreparably damaged, forcing him to start over. He sought out Ella, not with promises of wealth but with an earnest apology and a desire to rebuild trust. Ella, moved but cautious, agreed to hear him out. Together, they navigated the fragile beginnings of a genuine relationship. Months later, Adrian launched a new initiative, funding grassroots artists like Ella. Ella, finally able to pursue her passion, created a series of paintings inspired by their journey. Their story became a testament to the power of vulnerability, resilience, and love that defied expectations. As the sun set over Ebrington, Ella and Adrian stood hand in hand, not as a millionaire and a hired girlfriend but as two souls who found hope in each other amidst the chaos. Ella's unfiltered honesty contrasted sharply with Adrian's carefully curated world. Adrian's journey from a cynical loner to a man willing to risk everything for love and integrity. Ella's determination to rise above her circumstances and redefine her worth. It was a decision that shattered expectations and shattered family traditions. Edward Lansing, the only heir to the Lansing fortune, was being forced into an impossible situation. His father, Malcolm Lansing, a cold and calculating millionaire, had one condition before handing over the family empire: marry Rose, the humble gardener's daughter. As the high society family laughed, ridiculing the idea of this union, little did they know the tides of fate were quietly stirring. Years later, when Edward and Rose returned, no one could have imagined the transformation that would leave the entire Lansing dynasty in shock. Title: A millionaire forced his son to marry a gardener. The family laughed at him. But years later they were shocked when he returned with her. Malcolm Lansing was the embodiment of wealth and power. He had spent his entire life building an empire, turning Lansing Industries into one of the most influential corporations in the world. His ruthless business acumen was matched only by his cold, detached demeanor. To him, success was everything, and weakness was unacceptable. His son Edward, though intelligent and well-educated, had never fully lived up to Malcolm's expectations. Edward was kind, gentle, and had an innate ability to connect with people, qualities that Malcolm saw as a flaw. Malcolm's wife, Eleanor, had passed away years ago, and since then, he had grown even more hardened. He believed Edward was too soft to run the company and feared his son would squander the family fortune. Malcolm decided to take matters into his own hands, devising a plan that would force Edward to either prove himself or walk away from the life of luxury he had always known. It was during the spring, as the lush gardens surrounding the Lansing estate bloomed, that Malcolm first noticed Rose. She was the daughter of the family gardener, William, who had worked for the Lansings for over 2 decades. Rose had recently started helping her father with the estate's grounds. She was quiet, hardworking, and unassuming. But Malcolm saw something in her, a strength that reminded him of his own rise from nothing. He decided she would be the perfect test for his son. One evening, Malcolm called Edward into his study. He spoke coldly and directly, outlining his condition for the transfer of the company. "You want the Lansing Empire, Edward? Then you must prove to me that you have the backbone to make tough decisions. I want you to marry Rose, the gardener's daughter. No arguments. No discussions. If you refuse, you will be cut off from everything: the company, the fortune, the family." Edward was stunned. He had known his father to be ruthless, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. Marry Rose? A woman he barely knew? He didn't love her, and worse, he didn't even know if she would agree. His father's demand was a trap, an impossible situation designed to test his resolve. Edward's first instinct was to refuse. He had always dreamed of finding love on his own terms, not as part of a twisted business arrangement. But deep down, he knew that his father was serious. If he didn't marry Rose, he would lose everything. For days, Edward wrestled with the decision. He took long walks through the estate, his mind in turmoil. Finally, after a week of sleepless nights, he resolved to speak with Rose. When Edward approached Rose, she was in the garden, trimming the roses with delicate care. He awkwardly explained the situation, half expecting her to be as horrified as he was. But to his surprise, Rose was calm. She listened intently and then, in her quiet, steady voice, agreed to the marriage. "I'll do it," she said simply, with a glint of determination in her eyes that Edward hadn't expected. "I have my reasons." The two were married in a small, private ceremony a week later. The Lansing family was outraged. Edward's uncles, aunts, and cousins scoffed at the idea of him marrying a common gardener. They whispered about how ridiculous it was, how Edward had thrown away his future for a woman beneath him. Even the media caught wind of the scandal, and the gossip columns were filled with mocking headlines about the millionaire's son and the gardener's daughter. But Rose remained unfazed. She carried herself with quiet dignity, refusing to let the cruel words affect her. Edward, on the other hand, struggled with his decision. Though he admired Rose's resilience, he felt trapped in a loveless marriage. He had done what his father asked, but at what cost? Months passed, and Edward found himself slowly drawn to Rose's calm strength. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, wise beyond her years, with a deep understanding of the world despite her humble background. They began to talk more, and Edward discovered that Rose was not only intelligent but also had a sharp wit and a deep sense of compassion. She had dreams of her own, ambitions that went beyond the garden she tended. But Edward's family remained cold and distant. They refused to acknowledge Rose as one of their own, treating her like an outsider. At every family gathering, Rose was met with condescending smiles and snide remarks. Edward's cousins openly mocked her, calling her the gardener's wife and making cruel jokes about her future. Despite the tension, Edward and Rose's relationship began to shift. What had started as a forced arrangement slowly blossomed into something deeper. Edward found himself looking forward to their conversations and the moments they shared away from the prying eyes of his family. Rose, for her part, never complained about their situation. She took everything in stride, maintaining a quiet grace that both frustrated and fascinated Edward. But just as things seemed to be improving, tragedy struck. William, Rose's father, passed away unexpectedly. Rose was devastated, and for the first time, Edward saw her break down. In her grief, she revealed to Edward the real reason she had agreed to the marriage. She had wanted to provide a better life for her father in his final years. Rose had hoped that by marrying into the Lansing family, she could give William the comfort and security he had never known. Edward was deeply moved. He realized that Rose had made a sacrifice far greater than his own. She had endured the scorn and ridicule of his family for the sake of her father's happiness. In that moment, Edward's feelings for Rose changed. He no longer saw her as the gardener's daughter, but as a strong, selfless woman who had given up everything for the people she loved. As Edward and Rose grew closer, Malcolm watched from the sidelines. He had expected the marriage to break Edward, to force him to walk away from the company and the fortune. But instead, he saw his son becoming stronger, more confident. Edward was no longer the naive young man he had been before. He was making decisions with conviction, standing up for Rose against the family's mockery, and even beginning to take an interest in the business. But Malcolm was not ready to admit defeat. He devised one final test to push Edward to his limits. He announced that he was stepping down as CEO of Lansing Industries and that Edward would be taking over, effective immediately. The catch? Edward would have to prove himself by securing a major deal with a rival company that had eluded Lansing Industries for years. The pressure was immense. Edward had never been involved in the company at this level, and the deal was critical to Lansing's future. But with Rose by his side, Edward faced the challenge head-on. He threw himself into the negotiations, working tirelessly to secure the contract. Rose, who had a keen eye for detail, offered her insights and suggestions, proving to be an invaluable partner. In the end, Edward succeeded. The deal was signed, and Lansing Industries soared to new heights. Malcolm, though reluctant to admit it, was impressed. His son had proven himself not only as a businessman but as a leader. And Rose, the woman he had once dismissed as a mere gardener's daughter, had played a key role in Edward's success. Years passed, and Edward and Rose's marriage flourished. They had built a life together, one founded on mutual respect and love. Edward's family, however, remained distant, still unable to accept Rose as one of their own. But that all changed when Edward and Rose returned to the estate for a family gathering, this time with their 2 young children. The Lansing family, expecting to see the same couple they had once ridiculed, were shocked by the transformation. Edward was now a confident, successful CEO, and Rose, once the quiet gardener's daughter, carried herself with the poise and grace of a true matriarch. Their children, a perfect blend of both parents, were a testament to the strength of their union. As Edward and Rose walked into the grand hall, the family's laughter died in their throats. The mocking smiles faded, replaced by expressions of disbelief. The couple they had once scorned had become the very embodiment of everything the Lansing family valued: strength, success, and legacy. Malcolm, now retired and watching from the sidelines, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. His plan had worked, though not in the way he had intended. He had wanted to break his son, but instead, he had forged a new legacy, one that was stronger, more resilient, and more compassionate than he could have ever imagined. In the end, the family that had laughed at Edward and Rose was left in awe of the couple's strength and love. The Lansing dynasty had been forever changed, not by wealth or power, but by the courage to defy expectations and build a life on their own terms. Edward and Rose's journey from a forced marriage to a true partnership is a tale of resilience, love, and transformation. What began as a test of strength became a story of mutual respect, proving that true power lies not in wealth or status, but in the bonds we forge and the sacrifices we make for those we love. The end. The story begins in a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of a sprawling city, where Alexander Gray, a self-made millionaire in his early 40s, lives a life of opulence and success. Despite his outward success, his heart feels empty, and his marriage to his wife, Elizabeth Gray, seems strained and filled with quiet tension. Elizabeth, in her late 30s, is a kind, devoted woman, but she is often overshadowed by her husband's arrogance and drive for perfection. One stormy evening, after years of sacrificing her own dreams and aspirations to support Alexander's career, Elizabeth discovers that her husband has been having an affair. Heartbroken and betrayed, she confronts him in their grand living room. Alexander's cold response shocks her to the core. He accuses her of holding him back, making him feel guilty for his ambitions, and demands a divorce. In his eyes, she is nothing but an obstacle to his greater success. In an emotionally charged decision, he forces her out of the mansion, offering her a small sum of money as severance, a pitiful amount compared to his fortune. Elizabeth, devastated, leaves the mansion and disappears from Alexander's life. For the next few years, he spirals deeper into his work, his affair becoming a full-fledged relationship. He tells himself that he did the right thing, that Elizabeth was simply too weak to understand his dreams. But in secret, he feels an emptiness growing inside him. Elizabeth's life after the divorce is tough but filled with resilience. Struggling to make ends meet. Meanwhile, Alexander's life has taken a different turn. The affair he thought would bring him happiness eventually crumbles. His new relationship falls apart after several years of deceit and bitterness. The lifestyle he had so proudly embraced becomes hollow. His wealth is no longer satisfying, and his inability to escape the shadow of his former wife, who he now hears whispers of in business circles, gnaws at him. Alexander's emotional instability reaches a breaking point when his business ventures, which he had once believed were invincible, begin to falter. Competitors seem to overtake him at every corner, and the once proud millionaire finds himself struggling with failing investments, empty relationships, and a growing sense of self-doubt. He starts hearing about a mysterious woman named Elizabeth Gray, the CEO of a tech company that is changing the world. A chance meeting between Alexander and Elizabeth occurs at an industry gala. When he sees her for the first time in 10 years, Elizabeth is a different person, a confident, poised, and powerful figure, dressed in an elegant yet understated gown. Her aura is magnetic, and she is surrounded by people who clearly admire and respect her. Alexander, on the other hand, feels small and insignificant. His wealth may be substantial, but it is nothing compared to the empire she has built. Their eyes meet across the room. For a moment, there is a flicker of recognition, but neither makes an immediate move. The encounter is intense, charged with unresolved emotions. Alexander approaches Elizabeth, unsure of what to say. After all, he had discarded her when she had nothing, and now she is more successful than he could have ever dreamed. Elizabeth, he begins awkwardly, it's been a long time. Elizabeth looks at him, her expression unreadable. The years of pain and betrayal are buried deep in her eyes, but there's no trace of weakness anymore. She has become a different person, strong, self-assured, and independent. Her voice is calm, yet sharp as she responds. It has been. But I suppose that's how life works, doesn't it, Alexander? Some of us get to build, while others destroy. As the night progresses, Elizabeth and Alexander talk. They have both changed, but the wounds from their past still lie just beneath the surface. The conversation shifts from casual pleasantries to more personal territory. Alexander, desperate to regain some sense of control, tries to explain his past actions, offering half-hearted apologies. I was wrong. I know that now. I should have supported you, not pushed you away, he says, his voice filled with regret. Elizabeth, with a piercing gaze, interrupts him. You don't get to rewrite history, Alexander. You abandoned me when I needed you most. You chose your ambition over love, and you thought you could toss me aside like I didn't matter. But look at me now. I don't need you. I don't need anyone to define who I am. The emotional intensity of the confrontation builds. Alexander, facing the woman who has become everything he once wanted to be, begins to crumble inside. His life has been empty in comparison to the vibrant empire she has built. He watches as Elizabeth dismisses him, her dignity and strength leaving him feeling hollow. Just when it seems as though their story might end in bitterness, a new twist emerges. Elizabeth, having lived through years of betrayal, has been secretly working on an acquisition that will further secure her place as an industry leader. She reveals that her company is in talks with one of Alexander's former business rivals to acquire his failing empire. As the deal unfolds, Alexander faces the possibility of losing everything. His empire, his wealth, his pride, all are on the verge of being taken over by his ex-wife's company. The ultimate irony is not lost on him. Elizabeth, the woman he abandoned, now holds the power to destroy him financially. In a final act of desperation, Alexander reaches out to Elizabeth, asking for a meeting. This time, however, his approach is different. Instead of trying to regain control, he offers a genuine, heartfelt apology, acknowledging the depth of his mistakes. He admits that he's never been truly happy, that his wealth has always been a facade to mask his inner emptiness. Elizabeth, though initially cold, listens. She can see the change in him, but it's too little, too late. She has already moved beyond him, beyond the past. But instead of destroying him entirely, Elizabeth offers him a chance. She will allow him to keep a portion of his company's assets in exchange for his full withdrawal from the industry. She will give him a fresh start, but only if he agrees to stop trying to relive the life he once had. The story ends with Alexander at a crossroads. He can rebuild from the ashes, but this time, it will be on his terms. Elizabeth, having achieved everything she set out to do, walks away from the encounter with a quiet sense of peace. Elizabeth Grey, the woman who was abandoned, has risen from the depths of despair to build an empire worth billions. She has forgiven but never forgotten, choosing strength over bitterness. As for Alexander, he must now face the consequences of his actions and decide whether he will rebuild his life with the lessons of the past or let it all slip away. The story concludes with a final reflection on the true meaning of success, not measured in wealth, but in the strength to rise again after being broken. The night was still. A mother stood on the cold marble steps of her son's mansion, shivering not just from the chill in the air but from the icy words that had just been thrown at her. "Enjoy the streets, Mom," her son, James, sneered, his eyes cold as steel. His voice was calm, but the cruelty behind his words stung harder than any storm could. The front door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in the quiet. It was her birthday. She had never imagined her own child would throw her out like this. Little did James know, his selfish decision would lead to a chain of events that would unravel everything he held dear, bringing him to his knees in a way he never expected. Title: A millionaire threw his mother out of the house on her birthday. "Enjoy the streets, Amoam," is what he said. But he was shocked when this happened. James Hamilton was born into humble beginnings. His mother, Margaret, was a loving but strict woman who had raised him alone after his father passed away when James was just a boy. She worked tirelessly, often taking on multiple jobs to ensure James could go to a decent school and have a shot at a better future. Growing up, James was a smart, ambitious child. He excelled in school and always dreamed of making it big. But he was also deeply resentful of the poverty that marked his childhood. He hated the hand-me-down clothes, the cold dinners when his mother worked late, and the way the kids at school looked down on him. As a teenager, James vowed that one day he would leave all of it behind, and he did. Through sheer willpower and a sharp business mind, James built a financial empire by the time he was in his 30s. He became a multi-millionaire, with sprawling estates, fast cars, and a lifestyle his younger self could only dream of. He reveled in the luxury, surrounding himself with people who fed his ego. In his eyes, his success was his own doing. His mother, Margaret, was a relic of his past, a past he had tried hard to forget. Over the years, James became distant. He gave his mother a house of her own and made sure she had everything she needed, but he rarely visited or even called. Margaret, always proud of her son's success, never asked for more, even though her heart ached for the boy she once knew. She watched from afar as he became more consumed by his wealth, and as their bond eroded, so did James's understanding of the true value of family. On Margaret's 70th birthday, she decided to visit James. She wasn't looking for gifts or grand gestures, just time with her son. She imagined they could have dinner together, maybe reminisce about the old days. She arrived at his mansion, holding a small homemade cake, her heart full of hope. But to her shock, James wasn't pleased to see her. In fact, he was irritated. He had a business meeting that night, and he couldn't care less about birthdays, especially not hers. He had long since stopped valuing such sentiments. As they exchanged bitter words, James's frustration boiled over, and in a fit of cold rage, he did something unthinkable. "Why are you even here, Mom? I don't have time for this. You don't get it, do you? You just don't belong in my world anymore," he spat, his face a mask of disdain. Margaret, stunned, tried to calm him, but James was beyond reason. "If you miss the old days so much, then fine. Go live like we used to. Enjoy the streets, Mom," James hissed, his words cutting deep. And with that, he slammed the door in her face, leaving her to fend for herself on her birthday. Margaret stood there, her heart breaking. She looked at the mansion, the symbol of everything her son had become, and realized she didn't recognize him anymore. The little boy she had raised was gone, replaced by a man blinded by greed. She turned away and walked into the night, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Margaret wandered the streets, unsure of where to go. She had never felt so alone, so discarded. She spent the night sitting on a park bench, the same one she used to pass on her way to work years ago. The air was chilly, and she wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the weight of her son's betrayal. The next morning, a kind stranger, an older man named Thomas, found her sitting there. He was a widower who spent his days helping those in need, and when he saw Margaret, he knew something was wrong. She didn't look like the typical person you'd find living on the streets. He offered her a warm drink, and after some coaxing, she shared her story with him. Thomas listened with empathy, and then he said something that would change everything. "Your son may be lost right now, but the world has a way of teaching us the lessons we need. You don't have to go back to him, but you don't have to give up either." Margaret didn't want charity, but Thomas insisted she stay with him for a few days until she figured things out. He introduced her to a network of people who had been through their own hardships, and Margaret found solace in their company. These were people who had once had everything, only to lose it all, yet they had rebuilt their lives from the ground up, finding new purpose along the way. As Margaret began to rebuild her sense of self, James was facing a different reality. At first, he felt nothing but relief after throwing his mother out. But slowly, things started to go wrong. His business deals began to fall apart, his clients grew suspicious, and for reasons he couldn't understand, people began distancing themselves from him. He was losing his touch, and it was as if everything he touched was crumbling. His empire, once so invincible, was now unraveling before his eyes. One night, after a particularly brutal day at work where he lost a major contract, James returned home to find his mansion eerily silent. He was used to the emptiness, but tonight it felt different, suffocating. He poured himself a drink, but as he stared into the glass, his reflection seemed to mock him. The proud, successful man he thought he was felt like a hollow shell. Then, the nightmares began. Night after night, James would dream of his mother. In his dreams, she was standing outside in the cold, looking at him with disappointment in her eyes. No matter how much he tried to ignore it, the guilt gnawed at him. The image of his mother's face haunted him, and for the first time in years, James felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: regret. He tried to shake it off, but the nightmares persisted. His work continued to fall apart, and soon, even his closest allies abandoned him. It seemed like the world was conspiring against him, and he was powerless to stop it. James knew deep down that the turning point had been the night he threw his mother out. But admitting that to himself felt like defeat. How could a man who had built an empire from nothing be brought to his knees by something as trivial as family? Weeks passed, and James's life continued its downward spiral. One day, after receiving news that he had lost his last major investment, he finally broke. Sitting alone in his massive, empty mansion, James realized that his wealth meant nothing if he had no one to share it with. The empire he had built had become a prison, and he was its only inmate. Driven by guilt and desperation, James decided to find his mother. James searched for weeks, but Margaret seemed to have vanished. He visited the house he had bought for her, but it was empty. He asked around, but no one had seen her. It was as if she had disappeared without a trace. Finally, in a last-ditch effort, James visited the park where she had always liked to walk. He wandered through the park, hoping against hope that he would see her. As he reached the bench near the old oak tree, he saw a familiar figure sitting there. It was Margaret. She was talking with a group of people, laughing softly. She looked older, more fragile, but there was a light in her eyes that James hadn't seen in years. He hesitated, unsure of how to approach her. For the first time in his life, he felt small. When Margaret noticed him, her smile faded. The others in the group sensed the tension and left the two of them alone. James stood there, his heart pounding, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered, his voice breaking. "I was wrong." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, she nodded. "Yes, you were." James felt the weight of her words, but instead of feeling defensive, he felt relief. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to feel the depth of his mistakes. "I've lost everything, Mom," he said, his voice barely audible. "And I think I needed to." Margaret studied him for a moment longer before she spoke. "Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find what really matters." They sat in silence for a while, neither knowing how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But for the first time, James was willing to try. In the months that followed, James began to rebuild his life, not his business empire, but his relationships. He took time away from work to focus on what he had neglected for so long. He spent more time with his mother, listening to her stories, learning about the life she had lived without him. Slowly, they began to mend the broken bond between them. Margaret, too, found new purpose. She continued to volunteer with the group of people she had met, helping those who had fallen on hard times. She had found a community that appreciated her, and she no longer felt alone. As for James, he realized that his wealth had never defined him. The people who mattered were those who stood by him when he had nothing to offer but himself. His journey of redemption was far from over, but for the first time in years, he felt hope. And on Margaret's next birthday, there were no mansions or expensive gifts, just a small, simple dinner with her son, who had finally learned the true meaning of family. The night ended with a quiet promise: unspoken but understood. They would never lose each other again. The end. Daniel Foster, a reclusive millionaire, thought he was doing a simple act of kindness when he offered a place to stay for an elderly homeless woman and her daughter. He never imagined that beneath the surface of this seemingly innocent act, he would uncover a haunting secret. One fateful night, curiosity got the better of him, and he entered the basement without knocking. What he witnessed would change everything he knew about the mother and daughter, an encounter so shocking that it threatened not only his wealth but his very sense of reality. Title: A millionaire let an elderly homeless woman and her daughter live in his basement. But upon entering without knocking, he could not believe what she was doing. Daniel Foster was a man of means but of few connections. He had amassed his fortune through a successful tech startup and lived alone in a grand, three-story mansion on the outskirts of the city. Despite his wealth, he led a life of solitude, estranged from family and uninterested in romantic entanglements. He preferred the company of his books, his sprawling garden, and the calm quietude of his estate. One chilly evening in early autumn, Daniel was driving home from a meeting when he spotted something that tugged at his heart. Near a deserted part of the city, an elderly woman, frail and bent with age, stood by the side of the road. Beside her was a young woman, likely in her late 20s, shivering under a thin coat. Their clothes were worn, and their faces bore the marks of long-suffered hardship. Daniel, though not known for being particularly charitable, felt an unexpected surge of empathy. He pulled over and asked them if they needed help. The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Margaret, spoke humbly. She explained that they had fallen on hard times, had no place to go, and had been living in shelters. Her daughter, Rose, was quiet, her eyes downcast, only nodding as her mother spoke. Something about their situation moved Daniel, and without much thought, he offered them the basement of his home to stay in temporarily until they could get back on their feet. It was a spacious area, clean, dry, and equipped with a small kitchenette and bathroom. It wasn't luxury, but it was a far cry from the streets or the overcrowded shelters. Margaret and Rose gratefully accepted, and that very night, Daniel drove them to his mansion. At first, the arrangement was simple and straightforward. Margaret and Rose kept to themselves, rarely leaving the basement. Daniel provided food and basic necessities, making sure they were comfortable. He hardly saw them, as they were quiet and respectful of his space. The few times he did speak with them, Margaret was always polite, expressing deep gratitude for his generosity, while Rose remained shy and reserved. For a while, everything seemed peaceful. Daniel had done his good deed, and the women had a roof over their heads. But as the days turned into weeks, Daniel began to notice oddities. Rose, the daughter, never seemed to leave the basement. Margaret would occasionally come up to retrieve groceries or supplies, but Rose stayed hidden away. And there were strange noises at night, whispers, muffled thuds, and sometimes what sounded like soft crying. Daniel, a man who prided himself on his logic and rationality, brushed these things off as imagination or the natural sounds of a house settling. But one evening, an unsettling incident occurred that planted the seed of doubt in Daniel's mind. He had left a book near the entrance to the basement, a historical text he had been reading, and the next morning, it was gone. He found it downstairs in the basement kitchen, open to a page about ancient rituals. When he asked Margaret if she had taken it, she smiled apologetically and claimed Rose had probably borrowed it by mistake. Something about the way she smiled unnerved Daniel. It was too smooth, too knowing. Daniel's curiosity about the women grew. Who were they, really? How had they ended up homeless? And why did they insist on staying confined to the basement? He had tried to ask Margaret about their past once, but she had dodged his questions, shifting the conversation back to her gratitude for his kindness. The following weeks brought more peculiarities. Daniel noticed that Rose had begun to sing late at night, a strange, lilting melody that echoed through the floors. The tune was beautiful but eerie, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He often found himself lying in bed, unable to sleep, listening to that haunting voice until it faded into the early morning. One evening, Daniel returned home late from a business dinner and found the basement door slightly ajar. Normally, the women kept it closed. A flicker of movement caught his eye, and he instinctively stepped closer. From the shadows, he saw Rose standing in the middle of the basement, bathed in the dim light of a single bulb. She was holding a small object, turning it over in her hands as if inspecting it closely. It was his father's old pocket watch, something Daniel had kept in a display case upstairs, far from the basement. Without thinking, Daniel called out to her. Rose jumped, dropping the watch with a startled gasp. In an instant, Margaret appeared. Daniel couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his mind. The basement had become a mystery, and the more he tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at him. He began paying closer attention to the women's movements, noticing that Margaret had a habit of leaving the house at odd hours, often in the dead of night. Rose, however, never came out. One evening, after another sleepless night, Daniel resolved to satisfy his curiosity. He had always been a private person, respecting the boundaries of those around him, but something about the situation with Margaret and Rose felt different. There was an air of secrecy, and it was beginning to weigh on him. It was a rainy Friday night when Daniel finally made the decision. Margaret had left again, vanishing into the cold drizzle, and the house was eerily quiet. Unable to suppress the growing sense of dread any longer, Daniel descended the staircase to the basement. He paused outside the door, his hand hovering over the knob. He had promised. Daniel stepped back, his heart racing as Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs. Her eyes narrowed when she saw him standing in the basement, her expression a mixture of shock and anger. "What are you doing down here?" she asked, her voice cold, almost threatening. Daniel glanced at Rose, who remained silent, her face pale in the candlelight. I heard something," Daniel stammered, trying to gather his thoughts. "What is all this?" Margaret's eyes darted to the circle of symbols, and in an instant, she stepped forward, kicking at the chalk markings with her foot, smudging them beyond recognition. She grabbed Rose's arm and pulled her up roughly, extinguishing the candles with a wave of her hand. "This is nothing," Margaret snapped, her voice tight. "Just foolishness. Rose gets distracted sometimes. She doesn't know what she's doing." But Daniel wasn't convinced. There was something off about Margaret's demeanor, something too defensive. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense that he had stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to see. "I think it's time we had a conversation," Daniel said, his voice steadier now. "About what's really going on here." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. Then, without a word, she nodded and led Daniel upstairs, leaving Rose behind in the basement. The door was shut tightly behind them. In the dimly lit living room, Margaret finally spoke. Her voice was low and strained as she explained their story, a story Daniel never could have imagined. Margaret and Rose, she revealed, were not just a mother and daughter down on their luck. They had been running for years, ever since Rose was a child. Margaret's late husband had been involved in a secretive, a cult organization that dabbled in ancient rituals. It was during this time that Rose had begun to exhibit strange abilities that frightened even the seasoned members of the group. Rose could manipulate objects with her mind, predict events before they happened, and even communicate with the dead. Margaret, terrified for her daughter's safety, had fled the group, taking Rose with her. Since then, they had been moving from place to place, hiding from those who wanted to exploit Rose's powers for their own gain. But over time, Rose's abilities had become harder to control. The rituals she performed weren't for fun, they were an attempt to suppress the growing darkness within her. Margaret had been searching for a way to help her, but time was running out. Daniel listened in stunned silence. It sounded impossible, yet the events of the last few weeks had been anything but ordinary. He had seen the signs, even if he hadn't understood them at the time. "I didn't want you to know," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "You've been so kind to us." In the days that followed, things only got worse. Rose's powers began to spiral out of control. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered without reason, and Daniel found himself waking up to strange, unexplainable occurrences in his house. The basement had become a place of dread, and even Margaret seemed powerless to stop what was happening. One night, Daniel was jolted awake by the sound of a loud crash from downstairs. Rushing to the basement, he found the door wide open, and inside, Rose was standing in the center of the room, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols he had seen before, but this time they were drawn in what looked like blood. Margaret was nowhere to be seen. "Rose, stop!" Daniel shouted, but she didn't respond. Her lips moved in a silent chant, and the air around her seemed to pulse with energy. Suddenly, the ground shook, and Daniel was thrown off his feet. The entire house trembled as if it were on the verge of collapse. In that moment, Daniel realized that Rose's power was far greater than anyone had anticipated, and it was no longer under her control. Just as quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped. Rose collapsed to the floor, unconscious, and the room fell silent. Daniel knew then that something had to be done. Rose was dangerous, not by choice, but by the very nature of her abilities. If they didn't find a way to stop her, it could mean the end of them all. Margaret returned the next morning, her face ashen and drawn. She had been searching for a solution, and she had found one, but it came at a terrible cost. "There's only one way to stop this," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rose's powers are tied to an ancient curse. It was passed down to her through my husband's bloodline. The only way to break it is through a ritual, a final one." Daniel listened as Margaret explained the ritual. It would sever the connection between Rose and the forces that controlled her, but it required a sacrifice, a life for a life. "I'll do it," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I'll give my life to save my daughter." Daniel was horrified. He had grown fond of Margaret and Rose despite everything that had happened. He didn't want to lose either of them, but there seemed to be no other choice. The ritual was set for the following night. Margaret prepared everything, drawing the necessary symbols and gathering the required materials. Rose, still weak from her last outburst, remained unaware of what was to come. As the hour approached, Daniel stood in the basement, watching as Margaret made her final preparations. The candles flickered ominously, casting long shadows across the room. Margaret knelt beside her daughter, brushing a strand of hair from Rose's face. "I'm sorry, my love," she whispered. "I wish there was another way." Just as Margaret was about to begin the ritual, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. Rose's eyes snapped open, and she looked around in confusion. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Margaret hesitated, her resolve wavering. But before she could answer, Rose's eyes filled with understanding. "No," Rose whispered, shaking her head. "You can't do this. I won't let you." Rose stood, her body shaking with emotion. The air around her crackled with energy as her powers surged once again. But this time, there was something different, a sense of control, of purpose. "I can end this," Rose said, her voice steady. "But I have to do it on my own terms." In a heartbreaking moment, Rose turned to Daniel and Margaret, her eyes filled with determination. She knew what she had to do, and it wasn't her mother's sacrifice that would save them. It was her own. "I'm sorry," Rose whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But this is the only way." Before anyone could stop her, Rose stepped into the center of the circle. The symbols on the floor began to glow with an intense light, and the air around her hummed with energy. Rose raised her arms, and with a final, powerful surge, she chanted the words of the ancient ritual. The ground shook once more, but this time, it was different. The energy in the room seemed to gather around Rose, swirling faster and faster until it was almost unbearable. Then, with a deafening roar, the light exploded outward, and Rose was gone. The basement fell silent, the only sound the soft sobs of Margaret as she knelt where her daughter had stood moments before. In the days that followed, the house was quiet. The strange occurrences had stopped, and the air no longer felt heavy with tension. But the loss of Rose hung over the mansion like a dark cloud. Margaret stayed with Daniel for a few more weeks, grieving for her daughter. She spoke little, her once strong demeanor now fragile and broken. Daniel did his best to comfort her, but there were no words that could ease the pain of losing a child. One day, Margaret left without a word. Daniel found a note on the kitchen counter, thanking him for everything he had done and apologizing for the trouble she and Rose had brought into his life. She didn't say where she was going, but Daniel knew she wouldn't be returning. As he stood in the empty house, Daniel couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. The secret rituals, the dark powers, the tragic sacrifice, none of it seemed real, and yet it had changed him in ways he couldn't explain. He often found himself staring at the basement door, wondering what might have been if things had turned out differently. But the past was behind him now, and all he could do was move forward. Though he would never forget the strange, haunting events that had unfolded in his home, Daniel knew one thing for certain: some secrets are better left hidden, and some kindnesses come at a price. The end. Jacob Wells, a reclusive millionaire, left his wallet on the table of an upscale restaurant with a simple goal: to test the honesty of the waitress serving him. But what he discovered was far more than he could have ever imagined. This small act of curiosity spiraled into a web of lies, betrayal, and unforeseen consequences, leading to a life-altering truth about honesty, morality, and the fragility of human trust. Title: A millionaire left his wallet on the table to test the waitress's honesty. He was shocked when he discovered that Jacob Wells was no ordinary millionaire. He was a man who had built his fortune through a combination of shrewd investments, relentless ambition, and an iron will. Despite his wealth, he was distrustful of people and had grown to believe that money corrupted even the most virtuous individuals. Over the years, he had become reclusive, relying on no one but himself. He had lost friends, business partners, and even family to the pitfalls of greed, and this only hardened his resolve to keep people at arm's length. One evening, after a particularly tiring day of meetings and deals, Jacob decided to unwind at a high-end restaurant, one of the few places he frequented. It was a quiet, dimly lit establishment that catered to the elite. Jacob sat at his usual table, away from the bustle, and was attended by a young waitress named Emily. Emily was in her early 20s, struggling to make ends meet while juggling college courses and late-night shifts. She was soft-spoken and polite, with a kindness that shone through her tired eyes. It didn't take long for Jacob to notice her genuine smile and the gentle way she served the patrons. But as usual, he couldn't help but question whether her politeness was sincere or just another mask worn by someone looking for a big tip. This nagging doubt planted the seed for his test. As Jacob finished his meal and was handed the bill, he nonchalantly left his leather wallet on the table, its edges worn from years of use but still containing a significant amount of cash and credit cards. He slipped out without a word, watching discreetly from a corner to see how Emily would react when she noticed the wallet. Emily, finishing up her duties for the night, approached Jacob's table to clear it. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the wallet. She hesitated for a moment, looking around to see if the owner had perhaps just stepped away for a minute. When it became clear that the man who had dined there had left, she picked up the wallet with trembling hands. The restaurant had a strict policy about lost items. Any valuables left behind were to be immediately handed over to management. Emily knew this. She also knew the contents of the wallet could be her escape from the constant worry about rent, bills, and student loans. It wasn't unusual for the rich to leave large tips, she reasoned, and maybe, just maybe, this was some unspoken reward for all her hard work. But something gnawed at her conscience. She knew deep down that taking anything from the wallet would be wrong, no matter how much she needed it. Emily wrestled with her thoughts for what felt like an eternity, before eventually making her decision. She handed the wallet over to the restaurant manager, Mr. Hale, a stern but fair man who had worked there for years. Unbeknownst to Emily, Jacob was watching everything unfold. He watched as she carefully placed the wallet into the hands of her manager. A small smile played on his lips. It seemed that perhaps he had found someone honest after all. Or so he thought. The next day, Jacob returned to the restaurant, ostensibly to retrieve his lost wallet. He had thought a lot about Emily the night before. There was something about her that intrigued him, her moral compass, her quiet strength. He wondered if she would approach him about the wallet, maybe expect some form of reward for her honesty. Instead, when he arrived, he was greeted by Mr. Hale. The manager handed Jacob his wallet with a perfunctory smile, explaining that Emily had found it and had done the right thing by turning it in. Jacob thanked him and left, feeling satisfied with his little test. But as he thumbed through the wallet, his expression darkened. The cash was missing. Jacob's pulse quickened. Could he have been wrong about Emily? Or had someone else taken it after she turned it in? Either way, his trust in her evaporated, replaced by a burning desire to uncover the truth. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jacob called the restaurant that evening and requested Emily to personally serve him. She appeared at his table, unaware of the brewing storm in Jacob's mind. He made small talk, observing her reactions carefully, but she gave no indication that anything was amiss. Eventually, he brought up the wallet, casually asking if she had noticed anything unusual when she found it. Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "No, sir," she replied. I handed it directly to Mr. Hale, just as I found it. Jacob felt a chill creep down his spine. Was she lying to his face? Later that night, Jacob went to the restaurant's security office and requested to see the footage of the previous night. A bribe made it easy for him to get what he wanted. As the video played, Jacob saw Emily finding the wallet, hesitating briefly before handing it over to Mr. Hale. What followed left him speechless. Mr. Hale opened the wallet, pocketed the cash, and calmly placed it in the safe. Jacob was furious. Not only had Mr. Hale betrayed Emily's trust, but he had also proven Jacob's worst fears about people. He decided he had to expose Mr. Hale, but he wanted to do it in a way that would leave no room for doubt. The next evening, Jacob arrived at the restaurant with a plan. After finishing his meal, he discreetly called Emily over and slipped her a large envelope. Inside was a letter explaining everything: the test, the missing money, and the truth about Mr. Hale. Jacob told her to read it after her shift ended and to meet him outside the restaurant. Emily's hands trembled as she took the envelope, a sense of dread building inside her. She couldn't imagine what this could be about, but something in Jacob's tone told her that it was serious. That night, after closing, she opened the envelope and read the letter. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she learned about Mr. Hale's betrayal. All this time, she had trusted him, respected him, and he had stolen from right under her nose. When she met Jacob outside, he asked her how she wanted to handle the situation. Emily was conflicted. On one hand, she wanted justice, to expose Mr. Hale for the thief he was. But on the other, she feared the consequences. If the restaurant's reputation was tarnished, she might lose her job, and she couldn't afford that. She needed the money too badly. Jacob understood her dilemma. He offered her a proposition. He would give her a large sum of money, enough to cover her expenses for a year, in exchange for her silence. Or, he could help her confront Mr. Hale and ensure justice was served. The decision weighed heavily on Emily's conscience. Was it better to secure her future or to stand up for what was right? Emily chose the latter. With Jacob by her side, she confronted Mr. Hale the next day. The manager initially denied everything, but when Jacob presented the security footage, his bravado crumbled. Mr. Hale begged for forgiveness, offering to return the stolen money. But Emily was resolute. She reported him to the restaurant owner, who swiftly fired him and called the authorities. Though justice was served, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of disillusionment. The world she thought she knew was filled with more deception than she had realized. Jacob, too, felt a sense of bitter satisfaction. His test had confirmed what he had long suspected: people were corruptible. But in Emily, Jacob saw something different, a flicker of hope, someone who, despite the temptation, chose to do the right thing. In a moment of generosity, Jacob gave her the money he had promised, not as a reward for silence, but as a gift for her courage. As they parted ways, Jacob realized that perhaps not everyone was driven by greed. There were still good people in the world, people like Emily, who held on to their morals despite the harshness of life. But the test had also changed him. He could never see the world the same way again. A millionaire walked into a bank, expecting nothing more than a simple transaction, but what he found stunned him beyond belief: a pendant hanging from the neck of the bank clerk, the very one he had given to his daughter before she disappeared 2 years ago. His heart raced, his mind spun, and a chilling question echoed: how did she get it? The story begins on a cold, gray morning in the bustling city of San Francisco. Nicholas Holden, a self-made millionaire known for his success in real estate, had built an empire out of nothing. From the outside, Nicholas seemed to have it all: wealth, power, and influence. But what the world didn't see was the emptiness that gnawed at him every day, the void left by his daughter, Emily, who had mysteriously vanished without a trace 2 years earlier. Emily Holden, a bright, adventurous, and kind-hearted young woman, had been the light of Nicholas's life. She was set to start college with dreams of becoming a marine biologist, but one fateful night, after attending a friend's party, she disappeared. Nicholas had spared no expense in trying to find her. He hired private investigators, put up billboards, and even appeared on national TV pleading for her safe return, but every lead turned cold, and Emily seemed to have vanished into thin air. The only keepsake that held special significance between them was a small, intricately designed pendant, a family heirloom passed down through generations. Nicholas had given it to Emily on her 18th birthday, just weeks before her disappearance. The pendant symbolized their bond, a promise of protection, and it haunted Nicholas every time he thought about how she had it with her the night she went missing. This particular morning, Nicholas was on his way to the bank to handle some personal financial matters. The bank, Sterling Trust, had been his go-to for years, and he expected the visit to be routine. As he stepped into the bank, the familiar scent of polished floors and the soft hum of clerical work filled the air. The line was short, and Nicholas soon found himself standing before a young female bank clerk. The woman behind the counter was polite, professional, and unremarkable, until his eyes landed on the necklace she was wearing. His heart skipped a beat. It was the pendant. Emily's pendant. There was no mistaking it. Nicholas's world froze for a moment as he struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. "Excuse me," Nicholas said, his voice hoarse. "That pendant, where did you get it?" The clerk, a young woman in her early 20s with dark brown hair and nervous eyes, instinctively reached up to touch the pendant, her fingers grazing the familiar design. "This? Oh, it's just something I've had for a while. I don't remember exactly where I got it," she said, her tone hesitant. Nicholas felt a surge of adrenaline. This couldn't be a coincidence. He knew that pendant as well as he knew his own daughter. He had to find out more, but he couldn't risk alarming the woman just yet. "Do you mind if I take a closer look at it?" Nicholas asked, doing his best to appear calm despite the storm raging inside him. The woman hesitated, glancing around nervously before nodding. She unclasped the necklace and handed it to him. Nicholas's fingers trembled as he inspected it, turning it over to see the small inscription on the back, the initials E.H. for Emily Holden. It was her pendant. There was no doubt about it now. "Where did you really get this?" Nicholas pressed, his voice sterner this time. The woman's face flushed, and she looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "Please, tell me. This belonged to my daughter. She disappeared 2 years ago, and I need to know how you came to possess it." The bank clerk, who had been fidgeting with her hands, finally looked Nicholas in the eye. There was a flicker of something, guilt, fear, or perhaps regret. I'm not supposed to talk about it," she stammered. "Please, I'm sorry, but I don't know anything about your daughter." Nicholas could feel his patience wearing thin. "Listen, I don't know what you're involved in, but I will find out. If you know anything about my daughter, anything at all, you need to tell me." The woman seemed to panic. She quickly put the necklace back around her neck and mumbled something about needing to return to work. Nicholas, though furious, realized he couldn't push too hard here. He needed a new plan. He decided to leave the bank quietly, but he made a mental note of the clerk's name, Lily Adams, and promised himself that he would find out everything there was to know about her. Back in his office, Nicholas immediately called the private investigator he had worked with over the past 2 years. His name was Daniel Gray, a grizzled ex-cop who had a reputation for digging into the darkest corners of society. If anyone could get answers, it was Daniel. "I need you to look into someone," Nicholas said, giving Daniel the details of the bank clerk. "Her name is Lily Adams. I saw her today wearing the pendant I gave Emily before she disappeared. She's hiding something. I need to know everything about her, where she lives, who she knows, and how she came into possession of that necklace." Daniel, ever the professional, didn't waste time. "Consider it done. I'll dig up everything I can." While Nicholas waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of something big. This wasn't the first lead he had followed in the search for his daughter, but it felt different this time. The pendant was no mere coincidence. It was a link, a clue to the puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. Days passed, and Daniel worked tirelessly to gather information. Finally, after a week of investigation, Daniel called Nicholas with an update. "Listen, Nicholas, I found something, but it's complicated. Lily Adams isn't who she says she is. She changed her name a few years ago. Her real name is Allison Brooks, and she's been linked to some pretty shady characters in the past. There's also something else. You're not going to like this." Nicholas's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "She was involved in a trafficking ring a few years ago," Daniel said grimly. "But she managed to avoid serious charges by turning state's witness. She's been in hiding ever since. I don't have all the details yet, but it's possible that Emily may have crossed paths with these people before she disappeared." Nicholas's blood ran cold. The idea that his daughter might have fallen victim to such a horrific crime was too much to bear, but it also made sense in a sickening way. The suddenness of her disappearance, the lack of any leads, if she had been taken by these people, it explained everything. "Do you think she knows where Emily is?" Nicholas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't say for sure, but it's possible. She may know more than she's letting on." Determined to get to the bottom of this, Nicholas decided to confront Lily once more, but this time, he would be better prepared. He arranged for Daniel to monitor her movements and report back if she did anything suspicious. Nicholas wasn't willing to wait anymore. He needed answers. One evening, as Nicholas sat in his office, Daniel called with urgent news. "She's meeting someone tonight at an old warehouse down by the docks. I've been tailing her, and I think this is our chance to find out what she's really involved in." Without hesitation, Nicholas agreed to meet Daniel at the location. He knew it was risky, but the thought of being so close to the truth about Emily made him reckless. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away. The warehouse was dimly lit and surrounded by rusted shipping containers. Nicholas and Daniel arrived just in time to see Lily entering the building through a side door. They followed quietly, careful not to draw attention to themselves. Inside, they found a group of people gathered around a makeshift meeting area. The air was thick with tension, and Nicholas could feel his heart pounding in his chest. From their hiding spot, they watched as Lily approached a man in a dark suit, a man Nicholas recognized from the private investigator's report. His name was Victor Kane, a notorious figure in the criminal underworld, someone with ties to human trafficking and other illegal activities. As Lily and Victor began talking, Nicholas strained to hear their conversation. "You told me this was over," Lily said, her voice trembling. "I did everything you asked. I can't do this anymore." Victor's voice was cold and menacing. "You don't get to walk away that easily. You know too much. If you think you can just disappear and live a normal life, you're mistaken." "I've done everything I could to keep out of this," Lily pleaded. "I don't want any part of it anymore. And that pendant, it belongs to the girl. I didn't know it would lead back to her father." Nicholas's heart raced as he heard this. She knew about Emily. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Daniel signaled for Nicholas to stay back as he quietly moved closer, his hand resting on the concealed weapon he carried for protection. They needed to be careful. Confronting these people without a plan could end in disaster. Suddenly, Victor's attention snapped to their direction. "We're not alone," he growled. He gestured to one of his men, and before Nicholas could react, the lights in the warehouse flickered, casting long shadows across the room. In a split second, chaos erupted. Lily tried to flee, but Victor grabbed her by the arm. Nicholas stepped out of hiding, his voice booming with anger. "Let her go." Victor's cold eyes narrowed as he looked Nicholas up and down. "So, you're the father. I've heard about you. Your daughter was a beautiful girl, wasn't she?" Nicholas's rage boiled over. "Where is she? What have you done to her?" Victor smiled darkly. "You'll never find her." The next few moments were a blur. Daniel stepped forward, gun drawn, as a violent struggle broke out between Victor's men and the two of them. Lily, terrified and confused, managed to escape during the commotion. But Victor's words echoed in Nicholas's ears, "You'll never find her." In the aftermath, Victor was arrested, but he refused to give any information about Emily. Despite the chaos, one thing had become clear: Lily knew more than she had let on. As Nicholas sat in his office the following day, exhausted and emotionally drained, his phone rang. It was Daniel. "Nicholas, I found something. Lily wants to talk. She's ready to tell you everything." With a heavy heart, Nicholas agreed to meet her one last time. The end.